What's the obligatory first project when you get a new bandsaw? It's a bandsaw box, of course. Bandsaw box. Easy project, but I've never done one, so this could potentially be interesting. What I've got here is some white oak. This was a board that was 3.5 inches wide, something like that. And after milling, it came out a little under 3/4 of an inch, maybe 5/8 and change, something like that. Anyway, I just took this board over to the table saw, used the sled, and cut it up into about 4 or 4.25 inch chunks. I wasn't real precise with this because in the end, all we're gonna do is glue these things together into this big block, and then we're gonna cut the whole perimeter of it with the bandsaw, so it really doesn't matter if the edges all line up perfectly. What does matter is that the glue surface between these boards is a nice tight fit. Otherwise, you start cutting this thing open, you're gonna end up with pieces instead of a box. So out comes ye old belt sander. The face of these boards is pretty rough. I've got an 80 grit belt on here. I'll hit them with that to get them level, and then I'll come back and I'll probably hand sand them to about 100, 120, something like that. All right, these things are ready to be glued up into a block. One little piece of advice for glue ups: set your clamps close before you start spreading glue everywhere. Now, this is not the time to be stingy with the glue. Just remember, when you've got these things lined up, one of them is the top. It doesn't really need glue. Make sure you use a glue that has enough open time for you to get it spread around. Remember, we're gonna cut the vast majority of this thing away. The last thing you want is that one little spot where you didn't have any glue to be the one piece of wood that's left when you're done cutting. Depending on how long it took me to spread the glue out, sometimes I will let it sit open like this for just a minute or two so it can get a little bit less slippery. I'm trying to line up a whole bunch of pieces here, and the last thing I need is for them slipping and sliding all over the place. And your clamps are gonna have to be probably a little bit tighter than you're accustomed to because you're clamping a whole bunch of joints together at one time. Okay, if there's another trick to success here, it's patience. This glue needs not just to dry, but to fully cure and set. And it's getting to be winter time here in the Northeast, so that means a minimum of 24 hours. I'm gonna come out here and check this tomorrow, and if the glue around the outside of it, where there's big lumps of glue, those should be just rock hard. If they're even the least little bit squishy, it's not done yet. We're just gonna have to wait. Okay, glue's dry, so we can start thinking about cutting this thing up. The template is not an absolute necessity, but it sure helps if you don't have much of an artistic gene like me. For most paper templates, I like to use spray adhesive because it's considerably stronger than this little glue stick. But the bandsaw cuts straight down. It pushes the template into the workpiece, so a plain old steal it from your kindergartner glue stick works great in this case. Those of you who were around for the bandsaw build will notice that this is not the blade that came with the bandsaw. I have replaced the grizzly blade, which grizzly is the right adjective for that thing. It's pretty horrific. This is instead a 1/8 inch 14 TPI Timberwolf blade. It's pretty much the polar opposite of the blade that came with the saw. This is going to be useless for resawing anything. It is strictly for tight curves and decorative work where you want a pretty decent finish, like, oh, I don't know, a bandsaw box. The next cutting step for this block is to cut the back off so that after I cut out the middle, I can glue it back on and have an actual box. But I want the back to exactly match the rest of the box, so I'm gonna sand it before I cut it off. And one of the brutal truths of woodworking is that no matter how many sanding machines you buy, there's always some handwork left to do when it comes to surface prep. And Bandsaw Box is one of those times when it is particularly egregious. The bandsaw, even with a brand new 14-tooth blade on it, is a pretty rough tool. It's hard, especially as you're going around curves, to be real smooth and and not leave a lot of crinkles and creases on here. So you're gonna have to figure out how to take those down to a nice smooth surface, pretty much by hand. It doesn't all have to be done right now. For instance, this back surface right here, that's gonna be the end of the drawer. So I can wait until I cut that out to do most of this work. But things like these curves on the top and underneath the bottom of the feet, the rounded edge of the belt sander gets mostly in there, but not all of it. Don't be afraid of your rasp. If you have a lot of material to remove, this is going to last a lot longer and remove stock a lot faster than even the best sandpaper. Okay, went ahead and sliced the back off of this box. A lot of bandsaw boxes are too tall to do this on the table saw. You have to go back to the bandsaw and deal with another, not so straight, maybe uneven edge. But I got lucky. This is a nice short one, so I was able to crank the table saw all the way up and slice this off clean, straight, and smooth.
Cutting the inside of the box is just like cutting the outside of the box. It's slightly more critical because you're defining the wall thickness for the box. Not that it matters exactly what it is, just that you don't want it to be different everywhere.
Okay, so you're starting to see how this works. The piece we cut off the back is still intact. It doesn't have a drawer middle cut out of it. We can glue that back on there, and this becomes a box. Now what we have to do is turn this into a drawer, which means we have to hollow out the middle of it. There's lots of ways to do that, but this is supposed to be a bandsaw box. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the bandsaw and use the same technique that we used to hollow out the middle of this to hollow out this. We'll cut off this time both the front and the back. Then we can cut out what will be the empty space in the drawer and glue it all back together. But like the box, the drawer should match. The front and the back and what's left of the drawer all need to be sort of the same. So we're going to do the rough sanding before we start cutting it up. Well, technically, this piece that I cut off could be glued back onto either side of the box, but if you get it on the side that you originally cut it off of, the grain pattern matches up a little better. These are good joints on which to use a lot of clamps. Because remember, this piece that we're gluing back on here is really supposed to look like we never cut it off. So you want a tight joint. You don't want any gaps. But lots of glue, make sure the joint is full and clamp it on hard. Drawer box glues together the same way. It's kind of handy to still have the template on here. It lets you know which piece is the front. The alignment's a little more critical on the drawer box sides because you don't have as much material to work with when you go to sand it down, but trust me, you're going to be sanding it down. Okay, well, once all your glued up things are dry, just an initial sanding to level all the edges gives you something that starts to look like it might someday be a box. But unfortunately, I'm not even close to done with the sanding. I've grabbed the mineral spirits here and given this thing just a little bit of a wipe down so that I can see where there are obvious scratch marks or even yet bandsaw blade marks on here. So I'm gonna have to get the sandpaper back out and make sure that I get all of this stuff cleaned up because I am gonna use a fairly dark gel stain on here, and anything that shows up now with just the mineral spirits is going to scream at me with the stain on it. The other thing the mineral spirits reveals is one kind of a problem that you're really only gonna have with bandsaw boxes, and that's the changing nature of the grain across your project. If you remember, this was a solid piece, so the grain's running this way. Well, that means that I have end grain right here on the end, and then it sort of transitions. It's, rifts on kind of a grain here, and then it transitions to long grain on the side, and then it transitions back to essentially end grain on both sides of this little peak here on the back. Already with just the mineral spirits, I can see how much more the end grain wants to absorb than the long grain does. And then this little peak, because it's essentially end grain on both sides of it, if I were to put stain on here now, I think it would probably just turn black. So I'm gonna go to my two favorite go-to remedies for different grains and different absorptions. The first is, since I've got sandpaper out, I am going to sand the end grain parts of this to a higher grit. I am only gonna sand probably to 220 here on the long grain, and I'm gonna sand to 320, if not 400 on the end grain. And that will smooth it off, seal it off a little bit, make it a little bit less absorptive. if that's a word. Yep, and the regular viewers guessed it, we're also going to do a seal coat of shellac. But on this thing, it's going to be super, super light. We're talking 1/8 of a pound cut or something like that. I really, really want this thing to take color. I want all the grain of that oak to pop. So I'm not looking forward to sealing it up even with shellac. So we're going to go really, really lightweight. And, you know, I might do 2 coats or something like that here on the worst of the end grain. But mostly, I'm hoping the sanding is going to take care of it. This is pretty far from an exact recipe for the shellac sealer. It's a 2-pound cut in the can. I scooped some out with the measuring cup and I diluted it, I don't know, 1 part in 6 to 1 part in 8, something like that. The point is, I want it weak, but I don't know enough about the grain of the wood, the results of my sanding, or anything else to be obsessing over exactly what pound cut my shellac is. So just weak and go from there. Okay, well, moment of truth. Yeah, I'm in a rut. I'm using my General Finishes brown mahogany that I bought for my son's headboard. I can't say with any specificity that I have a reason for wanting to use this stain on this project other than I have it. I don't want it to go bad. And yet again, I'm dealing with these weird grain situations, so gel stain is going to be real handy. And I'm taking every advantage I can get here. Even though the gel stain is very forgiving, I'm not letting it sit on that end grain very long. The long grain can hang out there as much as it wants.
Probably some sort of a crime to put Minwax spray poly over a General Finishes gel stain, but I did it because I have it, and I'm tired of sticking my fingers down in all those little corners.
Little bit of alternating back and forth between coats of poly and my 4/0 steel wool. You end up with a finish that's not too bad. It's like the finish on anything else. 99% of it is the surface prep. And as I have mentioned a couple of times in the video series, this is not the easiest thing to sand. The saw curve plus the sanding leaves enough slop in the drawer box that you're probably going to want to put some little felt runners or something on the bottom just to snug it up if you don't want it to rattle. And likewise, the inside of the drawer box could use a piece of felt or flocking if you're into such a thing. I kind of like mine au naturel. I'm going to leave it that way. Quick shout out to Dave Picciuto over at thedrunkenwoodworker.com. That's where I got the design for this box. It was well worth the price of 1 beer to get his thoughts on the techniques and such things to do this, considering that I'd never done it before. But in the end, it's a pretty straightforward project. If you own a bandsaw, you got to try this at some point. Not 100% sure when the next video is coming out, guys, because the next 2 or 3 things I have to make are Christmas presents for other people, and so those aren't going to come out until after Christmas, obviously. But the best way to find out is to hit that subscribe button, and then YouTube will take care of the work of telling you when I get around to doing something useful. In the meantime, I'm going to wish everybody happy holidays, just in case I don't see you till the new year. And whether you're climbing the ladder or just going back to the punch bowl one more time, for heaven's sakes, stay safe, YouTube.